So I've been doing this ministry stuff for 30 years, ever since I was 4 years old. So here is the most distilled wisdom I can give you. Are you ready? Are you open? All right. Never, ever try to trick Jesus. Right? It never works. He sees right through it. And besides, isn't life tricky enough? I think life is very tricky. I think being a parent is tricky. How do you place your child and your trust in the hands of God and not become overly anxious? That's tricky, right? How do you give guardrails and accountability and consequences, but not overwhelm them with guilt and shame? It's tricky. Not impossible, tricky. We live in a complicated world, right? Do you believe that? I believe that. So we live in a world where people hurt others based on religion, skin color, hair, religion, political differences, and yet we are called by Jesus to hate no one and to pray for all people, even our enemies. It's tricky, right? We have complicated relationships. We live in a complicated world. And if you feel that way and you want something to guide you, then Jesus is your man, because he gives very good advice in this passage about those situations. So I'm going to talk about the background of the passage so we can appreciate what Jesus is saying, and then we're going to hopefully see how Jesus' teaching here liberates us. So tricky people with bad intentions come to Jesus. They know that when people face chaos and confusion, they want simplicity, right? That's me. When I want advice, I'm not asking you to give me kind of the spectrum of choices, right? It's much better, like in a chaotic moment and confusion, to give simple advice. So they know this, and they're trying to manipulate that so that they can basically cut Jesus in half. Because if he says, yes, we should pay taxes, then it's going to make this group angry. And if he says no, he makes Rome angry. Ha! Gotcha, Jesus. But Jesus is tricky too. And he's tricky because he aims at the heart. He says, pull out a coin. They pull out a coin. And a coin they represented was a denarius, which represented a day's wage. So it represented how someone spent their day. And then he says, well, I'm reading into the text, but he says, what is everyone's favorite narcissistic tyrant like? Their image. Yeah, so Caesar changed the coins, and every coin had his face on it. All right? And he said, whose image is on that coin? And they said, John F. Kennedy. No, they said Caesar. He said Caesar. And then he said, okay, so you need to spend, you need to give, you need to render what bears Caesar's image, and then you need to render or spend to God what bears God's image. How tricky is that? So the coin bears Caesar's image, yes? What bears God's image? Yes, we do. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, 28. Not only were we created, but we were created in the image of God, meaning that we reflect in our own lives some of the most beautiful qualities of God. We know love. We know the difference between love and hate, right and wrong. We know that we are made for relationships and community and togetherness. We reflect the image of God. So Jesus basically says, you need to think about how you are going to spend your life. Right? And it makes sense, right? One coin, One life. How are you going to spend it? So just like a tricky person, he puts the question back on us. I was looking for an answer, Jesus. Now you're making me do the homework, right? I wanted to look on your page. Now I have to think about how I'm going to spend my life. And that's why it's tricky. What does it mean to spend your life well? Martin Luther talked about this, and he talked about two kinds of righteousness. Civic righteousness was the first one. It's what we owe our country, and it's what we owe one another as neighbors. And he said that in our civic righteousness, when good is upheld, when good people obey good laws, then everyone flourishes. I like that. Evil is suppressed or subdued, and good or virtue is seen by everyone as something that you should attain to. I like that. I think we need to do that. Then he said our civic righteousness, though, is influenced by what he calls alien righteousness. I love that, because what image do you just have in your head right there, right? So he's not saying cosmic in that sense of outer space, but alien, that is something that comes from outside of ourselves. Meaning, what Luther was getting at is this, is that God's righteousness, that is God's Spirit, God's power, connects us to the power, the beauty, and the truth of Jesus' life and teaching. And that what Jesus did for us in Palestine and what Jesus did for us in his passion wrecks our hearts, tears us down, humbles us, makes us open to learning, and then builds us back up. And that because God changes us, then we can change the world. Okay? A changed heart leads to changed people. And a changed person can change people. Changed people change people. And then changed people can change the world. Isn't that beautiful? Can you get behind that? Yes. Render to Caesar. Give to your country what your country rightly asks for, and give to God what God rightly asks for. So, I would like to talk about something personal. Personal for me, none of your personal business, personal to me. And it's a journey of discovery that I have been on for quite a while. And I hope that as you hear it, you will see that it applies to a lot of areas, or almost every area of my life. Like you, I have questions. How's the best way for me to love my spouse? What's the best way for me to love each of my kids? You ever notice, parents, you can't love, like the love to this kid looks different than love to that kid, even though it's love. They're individuals. What's the best way for me to love my community or my church? And finally, what's the best way for me to love my country? I love being an American. I mean, I haven't been anything else, but I love being an American. I love having freedom of speech. Do you? Yeah. There are some people who live in countries that don't have freedom of speech, and they have to be very careful. Some countries do not have the separation of church and state. So belief is compelled, or true belief is repelled. And although I'm a Christian, I appreciate that we live in a country where we have said that each person needs to decide, and can decide, has the agency, the ability to decide how they're going to live, how they're going to believe, or how they're not going to believe. I mean, aren't you glad that we don't track people down? Right? Like, you don't show up next Sunday, am I beating down your door on Sunday afternoon? Maybe I should. I don't know. I'm just saying, I love being an American. There's so much to love and appreciate. Love is complicated. Yes? I grew up in Mississippi. Fantastic grandparents. One of my grandparents had a grandfather who was a prisoner of war. because he fought for the Confederacy. I was raised by parents who grew up in the segregated South. Different water fountains, my dad said, different school buildings. Supreme Court was right that separate cannot be equal. I have family who benefited from Jim Crow laws. I have friends who are not white, whose family members, whose great-grandparents and grandparents and parents were held back by those same laws. I had an elementary school teacher openly talk about attending Ku Klux Klan rallies. At my ordination into Christian ministry, that red brick church building off of Highway 30, 9.5 miles from New Albany, Mississippi, was jam-packed with family and friends. And when my black friend, who I had known since second, third grade, with whom I still text and call, when he walked in and took his seat, my uncle, who was a music minister at a different church, got up and left because he thought in 1996 that segregation should apply to the church. And I wonder how crushingly humbled my uncle was when he passed away and by God's grace alone stood face to face with Jesus and saw how much God loves color. Sometimes it is right and good to pray for someone's disappointment. Yes? So I lived with that kind of environment as a child, but not from my parents. And so it really bothered me. I became a Christian in high school, and I had to square kind of my very elementary understanding of Jesus and the Christian faith to what I had lived with and what I had learned from Christians. And then when I was in college and I began to study the civil rights movement in earnest, I also saw how my own country and my own state treated people. But I love my state, and I love my country, and I love my family. Love is complicated, isn't it? Man, it's complicated. So it took me a while to put it in words, and it took longer still for this to become conscious. But I had to wrestle with this. I can't change the past, right? So I had to ask this question of myself. If the gospel of Jesus goes deep inside my heart, and if I believe the gospel changes me, then how do I live in response to that? And it's this. The best way for me to love my country is to love Jesus more. Right? I mean, you agree with that? That it hits you? And the best way for me to love my wife is to love Jesus deeply. And the best way for me to love my kids is to love Jesus deeply. To guide them, to teach them, and to teach them forgiveness. And that if you make a mistake, there are loving hands that bring you back up to the heart. Right? That's what we need. So I don't know how that sits with you, but I can tell there's just like, boom. When we as Christians render to Jesus what is Jesus' due, that means that the status quo out there will not get a bargain. Right? I love this passage. I love Jesus so much. And so I had to see that the best way for me to love America was to include. Isn't that the silliest thing? It's not silly, but it's that simple. Huh. Or is it tricky? I don't know. So I had to include minorities of color and race, minorities of gender and sexuality, which meant, by the way, to do that, I had to leave my job before coming here. I had to fire myself. I bet you didn't know that. Yes, that's what brought me here. Because I was in a religious system where I said, I cannot do this anymore. And why have I done it for so long? You ever do that? Gosh, that's tricky. That's why I'm here. Because of Jesus and what Jesus is teaching me. And I also had to include minorities of religion. And I had to become a champion of women in ministry. Reverend McKenna, my good friend, serving as president of Mid-Hudson classes, this past week, do you know what happened? Our denomination, the Reformed Church in America, celebrated 50 years of women's ordination to Christian ministry in the church. And do you know where it started? It started in our classes. We have 16 women under the care of classes right now, ministry, right? I'm asking. I can't really see with these classes. Yeah. I planted a church in Memphis, Tennessee, and our very first church member we ever gained, we had a poker night. Just having fun, right? Just having fun. But she came and we hung out, her and her friend. She became our very first church member, and she is now minister of that church. I meet with Meredith once a month for the past 2 years. I will meet with her on Tuesday. I'm so glad that Jesus taught me to render, to give, and what it means to spend a life. So, there's a lot, man. I worked so hard on this sermon. There was so much I wanted to say. I really don't know how to end this. Pastor Dave, can you help me? Church, you only have one. You only have one. And isn't this world worth it? To spend it well. To just spend it well. Because your life will be spent. How did you spend your weekend? I spent it raking leaves. We talk like this all the time. So you put this coin in the hand of God, and you let him show you where to lay it down. Jesus is not trying to tear you in half like they tried to tear him in half. Jesus is actually trying to make you whole. And by making you whole, the world becomes whole, and then everything becomes holy. Spend it well.